Welcome to lesson 2 of module 8. In this video, we're going to be looking at maintaining internal environments. And in our last video, we looked really closely at homeostasis, but this time we're going to look a little bit more about how our systems in our body work together, including our hormones and our neural pathways to maintain that homeostasis, and then look at some of the ways in which our bodies, so of humans, animals, and plants, maintain their balances of some different chemicals and water in particular for plants. So an overview of our video, the nervous and endocrine system work together to ensure that a homeostasis is maintained. They help to coordinate and provide pathways of communication. And our messages usually travel from our nerves or our hormones to a receptor, to the control center, then back to the effectors for a response, and then we see our levels return to normal. Nerve impulses are much quicker, though, than using hormones in some cases. So when we talk about receptors, these detect stimuli if there are any changes from the set point. And we have different receptors that detect different changes. So we have our thermoreceptors that detect changes in temperature, chemoreceptors, which detect concentration of certain chemicals, and then osmoreceptors, which detect changes in osmotic pressure. Each of those are really important. I guess the first one for our temperature, chemoreceptors is to determine our blood pH, and then our osmoreceptors, they help us to regulate the amount of water that we have in our body. So the nervous system, the peripheral nerves are responsible for carrying information to and from the central nervous system, and this travels in the form of electrochemical impulses. Our neurons that are actually passing on this information, it may be sensory, motor, or our interneurons. So when we have our nerve impulses, they do need to be transmitted from one place to the other, and we see this happen in these 5 steps here. So we have our resting state, and then it reaches a threshold. We then see a depolarization phase of our action potential, where we see our membrane potential increase dramatically from the graph in the middle. We then see a repolarizing of our membrane, and then we see our undershoot. So it does go a little bit below before it heads back to its resting potential. So this allows the nerve, this is what happens as the nerve signal passes along. If we talk about our central nervous system, parts of our brain which are really important here are our hypothalamus and our spinal cord. Now, our hypothalamus is almost like a control center for regulation. It directs our effectors to carry out a response, and it's the main link between our nervous and endocrine system. It is also responsible for hormone secretion. And then we have our spinal cord, which is our conduction pathway for nerve impulses, but it also helps to coordinate any reflex actions. When we talk about our endocrine system, we are talking about the hormones, which are chemical messenger molecules, and these are transported by the bloodstream. We have 4 endocrine glands, which are really important in homeostasis. So we have our pituitary gland, which releases hormones on direction from the hypothalamus, and this helps to regulate water concentration. We have our thyroid gland. We have our adrenal gland, which regulates our levels of aldosterone. And then we have our pancreas, which is responsible, like we saw in lesson 1, for insulin and glucagon production. In terms of endotherms, we are going to look at the adaptations that they have to regulate their temperature. When we talk about endotherms, these are organisms that are able to maintain their body temperature within a very narrow range of tolerance limits, despite variations in the ambient temperature. So they might be what we called in the past our cold-blooded organisms. An adaptation is a characteristic that an organism possesses, which increases its survival and reproductive chances in its specific environment. And there are 3 types: our behavioral, our structural, and our physiological. When we look at the way endotherms regulate their body temperature, we can have adaptations in each of those different categories. So in some behavioral changes, they're going to change their position or their alignment. They may burrow, they may demonstrate nocturnal activity, or they may migrate to help regulate their body temperature. Structural, we're talking about insulation, so the different types of fur, maybe blubber, layers of fat, which help to regulate temperature. And then we also see the surface area to volume ratio, related to body shape and the size of different structures. So these include things like ears. So a large surface area to volume ratio means that they lose, or this organism will lose heat more easily, and a small surface area to volume ratio will retain heat better. When we talk about physiological adaptations, this may include changes to metabolic rate, hibernation, evaporative cooling, regulation of the blood flow to surface and extremities, and then counter-current exchange. The counter-current exchange is shown in the diagram below there, and we see that when we have our veins and our arteries next to each other here, we can see that our body is able to regulate its temperature a lot more, and that we don't see much of the temperature loss as we would have in the top image there. And our last part of our video for today is how plants will maintain their water balance, which is, I guess, what we would call our osmoregulation. So transpiration is the evaporation of water from the stomata of leaves, and this is the process that will happen in every plant. It lifts water and is a form of evaporative cooling. We also talk about, in this example here, xerophytes, and these are plants that live in arid conditions. And we can see in the diagram here that we've already identified some of the adaptations that they may possess to help them maintain their water balance depending on the environment that they're living in. So some adaptations might be a shiny waxy cuticle, which allows it to be waterproof to prevent the loss of water. White hairs help to reflect sunlight to reduce the temperature on the leaf, which a higher temperature will increase transpiration. Leaf orientation can change, so some plants will orient their leaves away from the light to reduce transpiration. Loss of transpiring plant organs, so this happens in some plants so that we don't actually see transpiration happening. Reduced surface area and leaf size. Shedding of leaves, and the regulating of stomata opening. And the stomata is the hole in the leaf. So if the plant can regulate that, it means that it might stay open at nighttime, and in the heat of the day, it is going to stay closed to regulate that transpiration that is happening and the water loss. That concludes our lesson 2. Make sure you tune in for video 3.